morning, everybody. Welcome to Flyleaf, our monthly conversation from the Office of Archives and History's publications section, where we talk with authors and friends of our office about things that they've published and interesting things in North Carolina's history. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Bob Cain and Jan Poff, former editors of the Colonial Records editors for the Office of Archives and History. And we're going to talk today about a recent publication of volume 12 of the Colonial Records of North Carolina. First, we'll do some introductions. I'm Joe Beatty. It's good to see you. Bob Cain, with us here, was the overseas document collector for the then Department of Archives and History from 1969 to 1975. We'll invite him to talk a little bit about that experience. And then from 1975 until 2001 was editor of Colonial Records. And Jan Poff was editor of Colonial Records from 2001 to 2012. And for about 20 years prior to that was editor of the Governor's Papers, also for the Office of Archives and History. So we've got decades of collective wisdom here. I'm glad to about this really interesting publication. I'll hop in with this first question. So this volume is the latest in the Colonial Records of North Carolina second series. What, Jan, does this volume cover, and how does it fit in with the others in the series?
Well, it's the third of 3 volumes on the Church of England in North Carolina. The first volume starts in 1699. This one ends in 1789. And it is in large part a compilation of events recorded by the people who strove to ensure that the Church of England fulfilled its mission as the established religion in North Carolina, in colonial North Carolina. And the people generating these documents are, of course, clergymen, but also royal governors, vestry clerks, missionaries from other colonies who had an interest in North Carolina events, and other people. Much of the discussion in these documents revolves around the state of the church in North Carolina and at the parish level. And letters, of course, talk about religious issues, but although the volume's emphasis is on the Church of England, the scope of the material is actually broader, or rather the topical scope is broader. Letters from clergymen often reflect the impact of their calling on their personal lives, and there are references to secular education for whites, blacks, and Native Americans. They discuss the state of the government, their personal health, the economy of their parish or of the colony. They talk about the Stamp Act, regulators, the coming of the Revolution. And so it's really a blend of topics that allow a fuller understanding of colonial life. And I often say this, but I really do think that each of these volumes on the Church of England are interesting enough, have such interesting content that you really could sit down and read them from cover to cover. I really think they're fascinating. And when I came into this project, I was afraid that I was going to be dealing with arcane religious discussions and how many angels can dance on the head of a pin and blah, blah, blah. But pleasantly surprised by the material that is discussed in the documents that comprise these volumes.
That's really interesting. So you've got Yeah, it's interesting to read, to see the documents and to hear the wide range of what is covered and discussed in this. The folks who are, the clergy, the governors, these folks that you're, whose sources you're using, we're sort of spying in almost on their correspondence. Is that right? From North Carolina back to England or wherever, and is that right?
That is right. And the really interesting thing about this to me is you're reading material from people who are living in the moment. They don't know what's coming down the road. They don't know that in 1776 the official church will be no more. They don't know that they might have to flee for their lives, these clergymen, or some of them. Anyway, so it's really interesting to read material written by people who are living in the moment.
That's great. Bob, does that sense of looking in on life lived out in real time reflect the work you did on the other volumes in the earlier volumes?
Very much so. Jan stated it well. The writers were good writers by and large, so it's a pleasure to read in that way. And as for discussion of religion, sometimes you think none of them are really concerned with religion because they talk about lots of other things than religion. I guess it's assumed that that's what they are concerned with. They talk also about their wages. They're not very satisfied sometimes with their wages, all that kind of thing. But by and large, they're uplifting documents to read.
It's nice to see. It's easy, whenever I get to talk about colonial, the past generally, but especially colonial life, we tend to imagine people's little cardboard cutouts always behaving in predictable ways. And it is nice to read people's mail and to see these things that were sometimes intended for distribution, but often were, personal or things where people, as you have said, where people discuss real life. It's always nice to read those and realize that people 200-300 years ago had many of the same kinds of concerns and problems that maybe we have today.
Yeah.
So for both of you, Jan, you're writing here about the Church of England, which was a powerful institution in the British Empire. And you suggest, right, in 1776, something wild happens and it's no longer the same kind of institution here. So what role did the Church of England play in colonial life and colonial government in North Carolina?
As the established church, meaning the official church, as the official church, it had, of course, legal standing, and legislation was passed by the Colonial Assembly to support the church. Naturally, that kind of that caused some resentment, but as an official institution of empire, the king's representative, the king was the head of the church, or the monarch was the head of the church, and as his representative, the royal governor was the head of the church in the colony. And the royal governor's agents actually were the clergymen. I mean, clergymen delivered sermons on biblical topics, but they also delivered sermons based on biblical themes of obedience. And of course, obedience meant obedience to the crown. So so periodically in the church calendar, there would be like Obedience Sunday or Oak Apple Day or something when the message was of loyalty to the crown was reinforced. And in order to get that message to stick, you wanted a clergyman who was of high moral character, who could set a good example, because otherwise, why should anyone listen to a ne'er-do-well? I mean, there is no credibility there. So, and you see letters from people like Arthur Dobbs or his successor, William Tryon, who basically say, we want clergymen who lead proper lives. We don't want the sweepings of the universities. We don't want people who are coming here just to get a salary. We want people who sincerely believe in the church and in the church's role in civil government.
Bob, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, that's true. There was a problem in getting good clergy in North Carolina because good clergy did not really want to come to North Carolina. They did sort of have to beat the bushes to get people to come. And in the very first one, a man by the name of Daniel Brett, he disappears pretty quickly from the record. He is charged with committing a crime too horrible to name. So the imagination can run wild on that one. But he, as I say, he gets going pretty quickly. And there was not an official church, an established church until 1701. That's worth mentioning, I think. Although the church did have a presence in North Carolina before then.
We got a question from the chat here about how many Church of England parishes existed in North Carolina.
Depends on when you're talking about. I would have to count them up, frankly. Off the top of my head, I'll say a dozen at the end of the period. Jan may have a different answer, but
yeah, I'd have to dig through. It's been 4 or 5 years. I think by 1776 there might have been maybe as many as 30 or 32 parishes. Parishes were coterminous with counties, so each county had one parish, and each parish ideally had one clergyman. Not all of them did. And so those clergymen who had parishes were obliged not only to take care of their own co-religionist needs, but also they traveled into neighboring parishes that were, as they said, vacant of a minister. There was no clergyman to serve the parish. So clergymen traveled thousands of miles a year just to not only to take care of their own flock, but to visit these vacant parishes, and it was grueling work, and the travel in one case, I'm not referring to a pastor in volume 12, but in one case probably killed a man. And it was a hard life.
It seems that way, and I recall from the Dobbs papers I looked at, sort of back to what you said and what Bob was saying earlier. I see Dobbs advocating for can we make sure that we can pay these guys so that they stay? And this really is hard work. It's I think I get the sense that the image of what someone in London had or someone back in England had about what a parish minister's responsibilities were probably wildly different here.
I think so. And the point about pay is important because Governor Martin temporarily suspended assigning or hiring any clergyman in North Carolina simply because he thought the pay was inadequate for the duty required. Eventually, he changed his mind because so many sectaries or dissenters were settling in the colony that he felt he had to do something. As head of the church, felt he had to do something to help stem that tide of dissenters, and of course he couldn't. So
Well, so you bring up a good sort of next part of my question, Nita. Let's talk about dissenters. What if somebody, the Church of England is officially the established church, so it is. Are all North Carolinians then sort of willfully or not supposed to be part of the Church of England? I guess that's a question. Are all North Carolinians then at that time assumed to be adherents, or they should be, with if their parishes are properly staffed and working? But what if somebody wanted to follow a different religion? What did that look like for these folks?
To do so, and many did, particularly Presbyterians. And Presbyterians gave the establishment quite a bit of difficulty, both in England and in the colonies. And Baptists were quite prevalent as well. There was one clergyman, he visited North Carolina briefly toward the end of the period, and he said that you beat a bush and out pops a Baptist. So there were a lot of them who gave trouble. One thing that made it difficult for the church was that all ratepayers in the parish could vote for the vestry. So this made for problems sometimes. That meant that Presbyterians could vote for the vestry, and on some occasions they would, vote their own people into the vestry, although that was not supposed to be done. They would do it anyway. Jan may have more observations along those lines. I don't know.
In Rowan County is discussed to a great extent through the letters of Theodore Swain Drake, who was the clergyman who volunteered to go to Rowan County. And the Presbyterians had things so sewn up in Rowan County that they really made his life miserable for the 2+ years that he spent there. They would, against the law, as Bob said, they would vote Presbyterians to serve on the vestry, and they wouldn't, and they would get on a vestry and they wouldn't meet. They would they would stonewall the church, and they told Drake that we can do this just as long as we want, year after year after year. The church will not make headway in this county. The situation in Mecklenburg was even worse. Governor Tryon would not send a Church of England clergyman to Mecklenburg County because he knew there was just absolutely no point, that the people of Mecklenburg would just make a clergyman's life a sewer.
There are lots of Presbyterians in Mecklenburg, as you know.
So we've got, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So we've got Presbyterians and Baptists, and obviously we've got a large
Quakers as
Moravian
well.
presence.
Yes,
Yeah.
Quakers.
Quakers were a big problem in the earlier period of the church. They were not as peaceable as most people's image of Quakers is, and they tried to get control of the government. They didn't really succeed, but they made trouble. and they were in considerable numbers up in the old Albemarle region.
Were these dissenting groups officially illegal, or was this sort of a kind of practical matter that there's only so much that the government can do? Or
No, they were tolerated. They were tolerated. I think they had to be registered. There were meeting houses, but they could have meeting houses. It was, yeah, they were tolerated, as I say. There was official toleration.
right.
In the case of the Presbyterians, there was one argument that was put forward that was never resolved by the government, that they too were part of the established church, an established church, because the Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian Church, was established in Scotland. So they felt like they were just as established as the Church of England people.
Sure.
But it didn't, as I say, it didn't play out, certainly.
Also, every freeholder in North Carolina had to pay a tax to support the church. These taxes were levied by each vestry. And whether you were an adherent of the Church of England or not, you paid a tax to support the church. So naturally, you can see that this might be a source of resentment.
Right. So you were free to not participate in the Church of England, but you couldn't elect not to financially support it.
That's right. That's right. And there were penalties if you did not pay your vestry tax. Your property could be confiscated and sold at auction, for example.
Whoa. Yeah, I could see that would be a problem. How many documents do you have in this most recent volume and maybe across the span of that trilogy?
Wow.
Another
It's a lot of fingers, right?
Parts, I think. I won't even make a guess. What would you guess, Jan?
Oh, I couldn't.
Somewhere between 1 and 10,000.
Maybe 200 in volume 12.
Okay. Yeah, that's we've got a ton of stuff here. All of these were transcribed by hand. I mean, we should talk in a minute about the process of building something like this, because I think it's a fascinating discussion. Before we get to that, I want to talk about how these documents got here. And I mentioned at the beginning that Bob did overseas collection for archives and history. You know, many, most, all, I mean, not all, but, you know, the majority of the sources, not just in this volume, but across the span of the Colonial Records second series, came to us through the efforts for collecting documents from overseas archives. So Bob, can you tell us a little bit about this experience, where you were, how that worked? What was it like to kind of dig up North Carolina's history out of this?
It was an experience that I'm still grateful for. My family and I lived in London, we're based in London for the 6 years, and that's always a nice experience. And most of the searching, my wife was a part-time researcher. Most of our work was in the old, what they call public record office, which is now called the National Archives. And frankly, the work that was done on the Church of England documents was from things that had been microfilmed by the Church of England and were available on microfilm. And what we did on the project was to get the microfilm and then make paper copies by a process that's no longer used, and accession those copies, and then do the transcriptions and the proofreadings and that were required, and then to get the final product. But most of the documents that I dealt with were not filmed already or known about already, and so it was an experience to see new stuff come to light.
And so and for the benefit of our viewers, you know, this is in the first half of the 1970s. You know, certainly we have microfilm. You had microfilm technology, but you didn't have electronic databases to search through, finding aids or things like that.
That's another thing. I come from the age in which we had to go through so-called finding aids, which were printed, helping you find documents, describing documents, and that was somewhat laborious, whereas but fun in its way. These days, with an electronic finding aid, you can cover so much more territory in a so much shorter time. But you know, sometimes the old ways are fun anyway.
It is nice to browse the card catalog every now and then and see what you find. So you're looking through finding aids, looking for times that North Carolina is mentioned or things.
Well, that's a good question. That's a very good question. I would go through the finding aid, and it seemed, and sometimes North Carolina is mentioned specifically. There are several. There is one clump of documents that deals specifically with North Carolina in the colonial period, letters from governors mainly, but a few other things as well. So I would find those, and naturally those would be ones that I would look at, and then develop a sort of sixth sense about what other things might contain. If it says, you know, just whatever, a column, something relating to the Southeast, for example, Southeastern colonies, something well might be there. Relating to Indians, something might well be there, and other things of that type. So they didn't always mention these documents. The finding aids did not always mention North Carolina.
It sounds like a monumental undertaking.
It was. Let me say this too. The copies that were sent back to Raleigh are in two forms. One of them's microfilm that we all know about, and the other is paper copies that were made in London at the Public Record Office, and those are very voluminous, and they're available to researchers in the state archives. And so it's hoped that researchers over the years will make good use of these and uncover a lot of interesting stuff about North Carolina that's not known now.
That's great. It's fun to look through those documents. You know, in my time as the Colonial Records editor, I had a good time flipping through some of those folders that, you know, have not been well perused over the years, and it's, you know, they always find something in there. It's good stuff.
Yeah.
Jan, can you tell us a little bit? Bob shared this great story about getting these documents from England and elsewhere to here. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of taking those documents and then assembling them into something that looks like this?
You let the documents do the work for you in a way when it comes to selection. You see which documents fit together, and they do. You know, they do. If you read them all and you see which ones best propel the narrative, which ones or which combination of documents give you or give the user the most comprehensive view of the subject you're dealing with and the time frame you deal with. So you make your document selections. You, as Bob said, you transcribe them. They are proofread numerous times by different people. They go to, they then are, well, they're entered, these days the transcriptions are entered into a Word, and so you hit print, and the transcription comes out. They're proofread, and then the electronic files of all the documents go to the book designer, and the book designer turns your files into typeset pages, and that is all proofread numerous times. And then it goes to in the case of volume 12, it goes to the printer, and eventually it gets that the printer's output gets inspected and re-inspected, and eventually the printer prints pages and binds them, and you have a book. If this were an antiquarian project, I'm going to insult antiquarians. I was going to say, if this were an antiquarian project, anybody could do it, because basically all you would do would be just collect documents, transcribe them, and print them. But an edition requires not only a knowledge of the subject, but the ability to see how things fit together. And you have to be selective. You can't take the easy way out and just print everything. It'd be to do that would be financially crippling, for one thing, and for another, a project wouldn't end. I mean, you just keep finding things to print, and so an edition needs to be focused, and it also needs to be comprehensive at the same time. And of course, you have to annotate things, people, events, legislation, and other things, so the users of a book will know a little bit about what the writer is talking about. And the footnotes for Colonial records are not extensive, simply because we prefer to let the documents do the talking. So that also affects your selection. Like you might initially decide you're not going to publish a certain document just because it's sort of repetitive, for example. But as you proceed through the assembly process or the annotation process, you might pull a document back because that document contains information that is stated better than or more colorfully than you could provide in an annotation. So you pull that document back, and it saves the editor from having to write a large annotation, and at the same time you have the color provided by the writer of that document. So so this writer provides an explanation for something you were going to write an annotation for, and it also states it better than you could.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think that's worth pointing out for our viewers, that this is not just a collection of documents, but it also contains, like, the annotations and the explanations and the introductory text is really, like, that's the value add in this, where you, Jan, on this volume, and Bob in these previous volumes in this series have really brought these documents to life and stitched them together with contextualizing information. And that's what takes it from, just being a document standing on its own to being a really useful and engaging body of work. I think that's that shouldn't go unsaid. And I think you're too bashful about this. You mentioned about transcribing. Oh, we transcribe the documents. I mean, I think I should have. I wish I had a sample document to share with our viewers. You know, these are very in quality, from sublime to tortured in their quality. You know, some of the handwriting on these is just profoundly terrible, and then, you know, and then occasionally you stumble across the clerk who has a beautiful and studied hand, and you can just read his handwriting all day long, and others, what we agonize for hours over a sentence to try to figure out what exactly he has written and what does it mean.
Oh, my hat's off to Bob in that department. It seems like for volume 12, nearly all the documents were really legible, but in the early documents, or in the earlier Church of England volumes, I have seen the documents that Bob chose for some of the documents that he chose for those volumes. And it's just like, Bob, you're amazing. I don't even know where to start with this. How could you read this? And it just, it takes, I think maybe transcribers are born, the good ones are born, maybe. So yeah, I think with part of Bob's job was to find these things, but even though he found them, the other thing is, you know, they're not any good to users if they can't read them and if they're not accurately transcribed. So Bob definitely has the touch.
Well, I must say I didn't transcribe all of them. I had a staff that did a lot. I did some, they did, and I did proof, you know, verifying what they had done, that kind of thing. But I had a staff, and Jan had to struggle along without a staff. So yeah, so I was advantaged in that way, But transcription is fun, sort of. You know, you don't really know what you're going to run into with some of these things. And selection is also another thing that has been said or implied, and the importance of selection, and that's why we have editors.
Yeah, I think, yeah, thanks for repeating that. You know, this is, yeah, it's an editorial process, right? It's all about making selections. I mean, this is the historian's work too, right? It's we make choices because we can't do and share and read and collect everything. And yeah, that's both, I think, an art and a science. Well, you know, personally, I'm grateful to both of you for your skill and expertise in this. I know at least a few times I would send you all a photograph or a scan of a document that I was working on, and like banging my head against the wall, like, what does this say? And more often than not, it was like, oh yeah, that's here. This is what you're reading. It's like, wow. So thank you officially for that. I guess I have one last question for you. That, and this, you know, this can be about Church of England or just about the colonial period generally. But what do you think our readers or our viewers would find most interesting about colonial North Carolina or the Church of England? You know, what's been most interesting to you, or do you have any particular documents or episodes that stand out to you?
There's one document in volume 12 that I think very well sums up how difficult it is to be a clergyman in colonial North Carolina. It was sent to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the missionary arm of the Church of England, by Reverend Alexander Stewart, who was based in Bath at St. Thomas's Church. And it was written in June of 1768. And he describes what his life as a missionary has been like, how difficult it is to travel, to tend to church business, not only in his parish, but in neighboring parishes who do not have a clergyman serving them, an established clergyman. And getting back to a point you made earlier, where people in England might not fully understand how hard life was in North Carolina. When Stewart came to North Carolina, he didn't have a parsonage, he didn't have a glebe, and he had to ensure that the house that he was promised under colonial law would be built, and he had to clear his own glebe. In England, if you were assigned to a parish, they'd give you the key to your parsonage, and everything was set up. Here, you had to do it yourself, and it was hard on him. It was hard on his family. It was hard on his health. Compared to neighboring colonies, North Carolina's economy was terrible, and hard currency was difficult to find. And so goods that you bought from neighboring colonies were expensive, and it was a hard life, hard enough if you didn't have a family, but it was made even worse. The financial peril was increased if you had a family. And so that letter from Stewart is priceless. It's a long letter. I think as a document, it might have run 10 pages. Printed, it's shorter than that, but it's an eye opener into what life was like in North Carolina in 1768.
Yeah,
How
that's,
about you?
you alluded to the neighboring colonies. Of course, Virginia had a well-established church, and their priests were respected more than the ones down here, probably, and they were certainly paid better, and altogether it was a nicer assignment. That's the reason they had North Carolina had trouble finding people, because the word did get out about what the difficulties down here were, and the ways you just mentioned. And South Carolina also had a good establishment down there. But these were admirable men by and large. There were some real rogues among them. And that's kind of fun to read about sometime, but sometimes you get a skewed view of the whole thing if you just concentrate on them, because most of these men went about their business in a dedicated way.
Well, that's great. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you sincerely for your time today. This has been a fascinating discussion. I'm glad we've gotten to share with our viewers some of your expertise working on these volumes across the years. This volume, volume 12, is the last planned print volume in the series. The Colonial Records Project continues today in electronic form, so our viewers can go to mosaicnc.org, that's one word, and see the papers of Arthur Dobbs, which is the current edition that's being worked on. There's about 600 documents up that folks can view and read through and search. And so this work continues, but we follow in your footsteps, doing much of the process that you described, Jan. Obviously we still have to do all this kind of stuff. We're just not binding it up and printing it. And but we hope everyone out there will have a look at this and enjoy looking at some new documents in this I guess now digital series of the colonial records of North Carolina, and there's going to be more ahead. We're going to work on the regulators and probably loyalists. So we've got some work in the works, so to speak. Bob and Jan, unless you have some final thoughts or words of wisdom, I'll thank you both. And I really appreciate your time today. And
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, it's fun to talk about.
yeah, it is fun to talk about. We should do this again. All right, gentlemen, it's good to see you. Everyone, thanks for joining us today. Take care.
Yeah, this was a dry run, right? Or was it taped?
No, we're live.
Huh?
We're live. This is the show.
This is a rerun.
That's
Oh,
right.
okay. Okay, well, thanks again. Jan and I both appreciate the opportunity, as he said, to do this.